by way of introducing myself, mention that perhaps I'm the only electrical engineer in this room. Anyone
Practicing or trained?
Yeah, trying to practice something else these days. So my brain works differently, and you'll get a glimpse of here how I make sense of some of this. I wanted to just sort of briefly mention, going back to the conversation we had at the beginning today about empowerment. What does empowerment mean? To me, Cure Together is a good example of empowering. I feel it's very transparent. You can define your own disease, you can define your own symptoms, you can define what did you try to do, and you can report what is it that it did for you. You kind of don't feel stupid, For me, more personally, I think empowerment means knowledge. That's just, if I understand what's happening, I can be a much more informed participant. I can even remember what I'm supposed to do much more effectively. But that said, I want to sort of transition into what I really wanted to share here with you today. So I led a certain kind of life till about 4 years ago, and then another personality stepped out of my old one. And it's this other personality that is talking to you now. And this personality is one that sort of, instead of just talking and reading and thinking about things, decided to throw itself into it, right? So this is in the spirit of the N=1 studies. It's one person's experiment with devices and tracking and making sense of the data. It clearly isn't designed to produce the kinds of evidence we would need before it becomes more widespread. But I'm beginning to think that I'm not the only one. I dare say there's probably others right here in this room. So I got my hands on every kind of consumer device that was available when I started this process. And one way you can get into this is to follow the sort of this quantified world, if you wish, quantified selfers and elite athletes. These are people who embrace these technologies because they have sort of other motivations, not necessarily sort of disease management. And for me, it was also using the data that came from it. I also took to running, and part of the joy of running actually is collecting a lot of data. So, as you see here, I was wearing 6 visible sensors on my upper body. A run isn't complete until I've got the data out of it. And the first thing you do after the run is you analyze the data, right? It's kind of sort of became a way of life. And the more intriguing thing, so yes, sensors, and you have data, but it's what do you do with the data? How do you analyze it? It's this derived metrics. It's not just calories burned, but is there subtler things that can emerge from mining this data? And the first thing, the good and the bad of it is that you find that these tools are already coming with algorithms that actually are using dynamical models to predict things. It's exciting and sobering. Like, this was a measure which tells you your stress level. This is like a 72-hour period. Up is recovery and down is stress. It's looking at heart rate variation data. Startling, right? I never recovered. So it's sort of like you just accumulate stress even when you think you're sleeping, It doesn't quite catch up as much as you thought it would. But the frustrating thing is you don't know what is this algorithm they're using. You might have an idea of your own. You might want to look at things in more detail. So it's sort of like whet the appetite. But what difference do these kinds of things make? So let me talk briefly about diet. So I was also watching my diet, and I was running, and I said, there are all these algorithms that try to tell you what's your energy source? Are you burning fat or carbs, minute by minute, right? And I said, well, let's experiment with diet and see what difference it makes. So this is percentage fat that you burnt during the run, right? It's about 3 hours here. And it's interesting. I actually experimented, run on an empty stomach, right? Basically carb depleted right from the get-go. And then I changed, and you see, so you transition to fat burn, right, fairly early. And then mashed potatoes the night before, energy gels while running, and then a precision sports drink called Enduro Optimizer with the perfect 1-to-4 ratio of protein and carbs. So is this real? Is this just fake? And I was amazed, right? I mean, you can kind of see how the curves stack up. It did exactly what it was supposed to do, right? And also the intensity, I'm sure you can't pick out all the details, the power you generate when you run, right? How hard you can run correlates very precisely with what you ate the night before. I've also, because I use all these different devices, I've been able to correlate these measures across different devices, and they're surprisingly accurate, right? So you don't have to feel like you need FDA approval. But back on the diet thing, again, thinking a little bit like an engineer here, there is inputs and there is outputs. You can eat all the right foods, but how do you really know what it did to your body, right? So you want to have some way of measuring something every now and then. So I obsessively tracked my data, nutritiondata.com. It doesn't just tell you how many calories, fats, but the amino acid profile. Being vegetarian, this is something to worry about. Then I also looked at my antioxidant resistance function, right? So what am I short on? And there is one thing that I was very short on. I had figured this out before I did this test by just looking at my data, and that's selenium. If you're a vegetarian, it's very easy to be deficient in selenium, right? So this picture down here basically was telling me how much I was burning during the day in the form of carbs, how much in the form of fat. The tools are right here today. You could actually find out for yourself. Instead of following the Surgeon General's recommendation on how many calories you need, you can find out exactly how many calories you're burning, what is that mix. You can adjust your diet around that mix, and you can figure out what it's doing to you, right? So it's actually quite empowering to be able to close all these loops yourself. So it wasn't just running. I've been doing yoga for a while too, and I started using these devices to try to understand what is the effect of yoga. Actually, I should show you this interesting thing. You've all heard about the Zio, which parses your sleep into REM and deep and all of that. So I occasionally sleep with my heart rate monitor also on. And it was quite remarkable. These time units actually line up. Deep sleep, heart rate really dropped. So there's multimodal ways in which you can get data. If you can put it together, we were talking earlier today about putting data together. You see, this is its own silo. This is its own silo. And the only way you do this is by lining up these pictures. If only you had the data that you could actually algorithmically work. I was also able to find really weird things, like what particular posture during yoga has what effect on me. Right? My heart rate dips really low when I get into this posture, reproducibly, right? These are examples of things that happen which, if you had very precise annotation of what you're doing, you learn. Instead of vague feelings, you can actually quantify these things. So this is RR intervals, interbeat intervals. I'm sure a lot of you know about this. It seems to entrain many of the physiological things that you're going through. So it's from a point of view of DSP, you can algorithmically sit here and mine this thing endlessly to infer things about what's going on. So there are people who show up to a yoga class expecting this experience, and there are people who go running expecting this experience, right? To sort of, you can begin to see. So this is RR intervals. The higher the curve, the greater the activation of your parasympathetic, the relaxation response. And you can find out, in fact, what style of yoga works for you. So then the next thing we wanted to do actually was try to understand group effects. So there's a lot of this sort of insight, from meditation, from even listening to music that you can derive that I was actually quite astonished. But we said, are there group effects here? So if we have a practice together, why do people go out running together or they do yoga together? Is there some entanglement that takes place? So we built some tools that allow you to not just study one individual, but groups of individuals. I won't go into too many details here, but this is time on the x-axis. On the y-axis is periodicities of variations in your heart rate, variation data. Red means strong correlation, blue means light correlation. So you might think of the red pieces as indicating certain shared experience that is taking place during that time, in this frequency band, which might map to some physiological state. So there's standard ways in which one thinks about it, breathing and so on. And we were able to generalize this to look at groups more than 2 at a time. And these are real recordings that we've made, mostly from sessions of meditation. And you find interesting things. This is a group of about 9 people, right? They seem to fall into certain patterns at certain points in time, not the rest of the time, right? So it seems like you can quantify these group effects. That's more of that. So once you do that, you begin to then think in terms of social networks. Are there individuals? So these are, for example, the subjects who were participating in this exercise. And so there are different activities here, A1, A2, A3, and so on. And what we have here is a network diagram where the thickness of the line that connects them is proportional to how entrained they were, right? And you see interesting things. So for example, during this particular activity here, A6, S7 is actually most connected with everybody else, right? He has a thin line or a thick line, but over here, S7 completely checked out, so to say, right? So these are pretty subtle effects. They're separated by just a few minutes, and it's a combination of what the person's intentions are and what they're actually physically doing. But it seemed like there are tools here that will help you understand, essentially in real time, a lot of these effects that we live through. So we've created our own little, we looked around, again, it's the same story. There are lots of data silos, and there's no place where you can, like throw data, grab techniques, and see for yourself if this makes a difference. So we decided to create our own open silo. So this is healthware.ucsd.edu. It's actually work in progress. You can upload whatever data types you want. It's the same idea that we've talked about in some of these other things where, hopefully there'll be other algorithms and you can apply it and see for yourself if these experiences that appear to have some meaning for you actually have a basis. So I welcome you to kind of poke around. But here's an example of something unexpected for all the years I've spent doing this. So we do this session of Kundalini meditation. I don't know if you're familiar with this style of meditation, but it appears to sort of trigger things in the mind more than the physical body, right? And you can listen to the way they describe what they do, and you can, you might dismiss it. You might not know what to make of it. How real is it? But one of the things we're trying to do is to build algorithms that will troll through large data sets and pick out things when something interesting happened, even if the person didn't remember to mark it, right? So did something special occur during the last 24 hours in your day? So on this particular day, something really remarkable happened when we were doing this little gesture, okay, which is very simple. All you do is put your thumb against the bridge of your nose and press hard. And you hold that and you breathe evenly. There is no chanting, nothing else going on, right? You just sit there quietly. And what we found was, for me, something that I think the motivation for it comes from a paper. It has to do with how do you express health. So there is this one measure that is used in the literature to study heart rate variation. It's called PNN50. It's the percentage of successive interbeat intervals that deviate from each other by more than 50 milliseconds, right? So we just grabbed this as an example. And what they did was this large-scale study where they looked at kids from the age of 10 to the age of 90, and they plotted regression lines. And there are even these cutoff lines that indicate, people who are at risk. So if the variation goes below that, it's a sign that maybe they are diseased and so on. So let's say you have a certain age and you figure out your whatever the parameter is during that activity. You can specify it as a percentile. You can say, you're in the 99th percentile, or in the 60th percentile, or the 50th percentile. But it's a lot more motivating if you go in the other direction, right? What is your age, assuming you were a person that represented that average, right? So it's like, what's your heart age? It's much more motivating if a 50-year-old discovers after doing something that they have a heart whose age is 10, right? You feel you're younger as opposed to being told you're in the 99th percentile. What does 99th percentile really mean to you? Doesn't mean anything. And so what we have tried to do are examples of these sorts of things. What do people really relate to? And what we found was something really remarkable. This particular gesture, for whatever it is, it is doing, it produces a remarkably high PNN50, quite reproducibly. Right? So this is, in some ways, a little journey on how you take advantage of the state of the art in the world of devices, tools that are available to analyze this data and reflect it back in a way that allows a community to sort of experiment with these things together and relate it to things that may have physiological significance. So you kind of keep your practice going. Now, while I have shared my particular story, we are wanting to see if these ideas can actually have sort of broader resonance, if there may be a larger group of experiments that people might do themselves. Going back to Cure Together, there's a lot of interesting things in Cure Together, but one of the things that they have a placeholder for, but nothing specific, is device data, right? Can I upload my device data? So when I did this, when I took this drug, or when I practiced this form of therapy, what did it do to my heart, to my relaxation response? So augmenting the information that people are able to share to not only include statements they make, but also actual measurables without going to a clinic.